Alright, so I want to show quests next, but before I do, I was setting up kind of a more complicated conversation here, and I wanted to share how I did that. So let me just play it out first, and then I'll go through how I set it up. So with James here, when I talk to him, he says something, and then the player can say a response. And then I have two follow-ups. I can either say, better than outside, or who are you yelling at in the garage? And so it doesn't really matter which one I pick. When it's done with that, it takes me back, and I, in theory, will pick the one I haven't picked before. And once I've chosen both options, it takes me to this new choice where I ask if he's got a plan. And so after that, he's done talking to me. So let's walk through how I set that up. If you look at this conversation, it starts off and it goes right into the first James line. Then there's the player line. Then there's another James line. And then here's where it gets a little different. So rather than leading to player choices directly from this, I created a new node. I'm just going to delete it from this. It doesn't need to be connected to the start. And I made it a group. And the reason I make it a group is it's going to basically be a collection of responses that the player could choose. But I don't want it to... So like, the reason I group them is when you finish this, so the player chooses this dialogue response, James replies with this. What I want to do is go back to basically this one and represent both dialogue options again. But the issue with just linking back to this one is that would replay this line. And I don't want to replay that line, so instead I made this group, which is like, it doesn't actually get spoken by the characters. It's just a way to kind of group messages. In this case, it's a collection of response options. So when the James finishes this line, rather than going back here, which would cause James to say this again, I go back to the group, which then leaves this as James's last line, but still presents the player with these options. Now, the second part of this setup, actually, before I go forward, so the way you do that is you just make an empty one that's going to kind of serve as a folder, and you just check group. And that's how I did it. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it, this new one I made. You can see this one is set to be a group as well. And the second part of this setup that's kind of complex is this one. You can see the little question mark. It has conditions. So the reason that you don't see this choice until you've seen these two, or until you've picked these two, is that I have these conditions set up with something called SimStatus. SimStatus and dialogue system, I'm going to go ahead and stop the game. If you click on the dialogue manager, SimStatus is what the terminology dialogue system uses for tracking whether or not a given dialogue has been presented to the player or has been spoken by one of the actors. And it's not tracked by default because I think it has some, I guess you could say, like performance overhead, especially with like save games. If you are tracking tons of, like, basically it's creating variables for every single dialogue, which could get crazy. In my game, it's going to be very short, and I'm not going to support saving, so it's not a big deal. So I went ahead to turn it on just to show you how it works. if you didn't want to use this approach, you could just make variables for the actual lines that you care about, and then when the player chooses those options, or when those options come up in the flow here, you could just add a script that sets the value of the variable. And that stuff's covered in the dialog system video tutorials, so just check that out if that's something you're interested in. But for the SimStatus, you have to turn it on. It's on Dialog Manager. And there's just a choice that says Use SimStatus somewhere. There we go, at the bottom in Other Settings. So if Other Settings is collapsed, you want to expand it. You want to find Use or Include SimStatus. And so you go ahead and check that. And then if we go back to our dialog, I can kind of show you how it's set up. So the dialog system conversation editor has a way to kind of visually click through adding Lua script. It uses Lua script to include conditions and sequences and things like that. But you don't have to necessarily know it all. You can use this like little wizard it includes to add them. So let me kind of walk through that process. So I'm just going to click a random one here that's not, maybe I'll just make a new one. Create node. All right, I'll delete this eventually. In fact, I'm going to delete the link well, I'll remember to delete it. Anyway, so I'm going to go over to conditions and I'm going to click the 3 dots. That's how you get the wizard open. And it's kind of tricky. There's maybe more clicks than you're thinking. So with conditions, you want to set if all of the conditions have to be true or any of the conditions have to be true. And you want to leave append selected because that's going to decide, like, as you continue to add things with the wizard, is it going to like combine with the previous things you've added or not? And that's what append does. So I would just leave it checked so each new thing you add is combined with the previous logic you've added. So I click the 3 dots, then I'm going to make sure they're all true, and I'm going to hit the plus button, and here's where I set what I'm tracking. Let's not worry about quests yet. I'm going to walk through that later, but I'm going to go to SimStatus. And remember, this will only work if you've included SimStatus by checking that in the dialog manager. Now, I don't want it to be this ID. That would be, I guess, this very dialog. I don't care about that one. I want to check if you've seen a different one. And so the one I care about is like this one right here. If you click it, so you can see it's ID number 2. So I'm going to go over here. Oh, well, let me start over because when I exited that in the middle, it did some stuff, and I don't want to do that yet. So I'm going to click the wizard. I'm going to click add SimStatus. I'm going to change it to 11, and I want to see if it was displayed, but you can see there's other choices here. Displayed means it actually was picked. An actor set it. And then the last step is to click apply. And that'll finally add it. So if you knew the syntax, you could just type that straight in there and it would work, right? Now there's a little bit of a catch here, and I don't know if it's something I'm missing or if it's an issue with dialog system. But we looked at the ID here, and it's ID 2. I don't know if I picked 11. If I picked 11, it's probably because this one is 11 and I need to actually track them both. So anyway, we're tracking if this one's been displayed. And it's number 11. And so that makes sense why I picked 11. But the other issue is that if I were to go into another one of my conversations, like, I don't know, one that has a lot of stuff, if I really have anything with a lot of stuff, I guess I don't really, but these things, multiple dialogues can have the same ID. And the way that we overcome that is that each conversation has its own ID. So this would be conversation 8. I just clicked in the blank space here. This is how I can see the name of the conversation, Remy Barks. Conversation 8, dialogue 1. So if I go back to my James. I know that I'm caring about dialog 11, but I need to add conversation 5 to this. And this is where, like I said, I don't know if I'm messing up or if it's just something that's been overlooked in this wizard. But the only way I know to do this is to just manually type in conversation, open brackets, 5, close brackets, and then period. So it's conversation 5 dot dialog 11 dot SimStatus was displayed. So the part I had to add was the conversation number inside of the brackets and then a period. If you're used to writing code, this might seem natural to you. If you've never dealt with code before, this is probably really out there. So just go with it for now and take some intro to programming tutorials somewhere down the road. That's my advice. It's valuable. All right. So that's how I can check if just this line was spoken. But if I want to check both of them, this one here was number 2. So it's conversation 5, dialogue 2. So I would click the 3 dots and I want to add, and I want them all to be true, not any. But if I wanted either one, I'd choose any. And I'm going to hit plus, and I'm going to make sure I've got SimStatus, and I'm going to change it to conversation 2. I still want was displayed, so I'm going to hit apply. And you can see it added some stuff here. So it added and then parentheses in the second condition. And this is fine, except I have to go in and manually add conversation brackets 5, close brackets, period. And the period, all of that's essential. So that's just helping me identify what conversation ID, and then inside of that conversation, what dialogue ID I care about. And then inside of that dialogue, we're checking the SimStatus variable, and we're checking to see if it was displayed. So that's exactly how I have this set up here. So this is just I could like copy that paste it here, and it's basically the same deal. I'm going to delete this one now and stop this video. Now you've seen how I kind of set up this conversation with groups and with SimStatus conditions.